If I was to ask you, what do you think is the key to creativity? I would hear passion, dedication, courage, skill. But what about context? What about the environment in which we are born, the environment in which we live and grow up, the environment in which we work or study? Because as we know, creativity is almost never about starting from scratch. Creativity is the ability to take what's around and what's already available and reimagine, recreate, and bring to life new ways of doing things, new ways of solving problems, new ways of teaching, new ways of learning, new ways of impacting our communities, new ways of communicating, new ways of expressing ourselves, and simply, sometimes, new ways of having fun. Now, let me know if you recognize this little song here, and if you do, please go ahead and sing along, okay? That wasn't loud enough. I can't barely hear you from up here. So we'll try that again, okay? So 1, 2, 3, 4. There you go. One more time. Nice. So there's no limit to what we can do here in that little context, okay? Here's a plastic bottle with some beans in it. Perfect shaker. Oh yeah, I brought along some pan. I'll probably get in trouble at home for bringing this here. Favorite choice when it comes to when I'm in need of a drum set or percussion. Nothing better than an old tube of paper towel and some wax paper to make the perfect sounding kazoo. What else? Beer bottles, rubber bands, and let's see. Oh yeah, this thing, whatever this thing is. Should have seen the looks of people seeing me carrying this thing around on the way here. So what happens when you mix all this with a whole lot of free time? Well, let's find out, shall we? Here's a quick mashup video of some of the videos I've put on YouTube. Let's watch. Thank you. So even though I'm mostly known online for videos on YouTube and my music, I'm primarily an entrepreneur and a software developer. And as I go around the country speaking in schools and conferences about my work or my videos or the importance of STEM in education, I can't help but get into these conversations about creativity or what it takes to reach a certain level of creativity. From simple levels of creativity, like wine glasses to make music, or very high and complex levels of creativity like finding a cure to cancer. And as much as we'd like to think that creativity is always the result of one's imagination and unusual ability to then bring it to life, the truth is that the environment around the creator, what I call the context, is just as important because it acts as some kind of framework without which the creative process simply can't exist. Environment or context. Webster's defines context as the situation in which something happens, or a group of conditions that exist where and when something happens. And regardless of what you choose to be creative in, regardless of how and where and why you express your creativity, regardless of where you live, one truth is universal. While creativity has no limits, it always requires the right context. Now, I lived and grew up in what could be considered a bad context by any standards for creativity. And that's because my story begins long before YouTube and long before this talk. My story begins 20 years ago on the other side of the world, in the heart of the continent of Africa, in the Congo, also known as the DRC. Now it's a huge country of 70 million people, almost 1 million square miles of mostly unexplored land. Country known for its people, its art, its beautiful culture and nature. Also known for its ridiculous amount of natural resources: gold, diamond, copper, uranium, tin, and 80% of the world's reserve of coltan. Coltan, which is used in the manufacturing of mobile phones and laptops and video games and cameras and tablets. Coltan also at the center of decades of war and political unrest in my country. In October of 1996, as the war was getting at its worst, my family and I found ourselves basically stuck in our own house for several days and nights at a time. Every night more terrifying than the one before. Pitch dark, except for the grenades and loud explosions and flying bullets outside and inside a single candle on the floor, because there's no electricity during war. Who was fighting who? I really didn't care. 11-year-old me really did not care. I just knew we had to survive. I just knew we had to be safe. I actually just knew we had to at least feel safe. And I guess my parents did too. So they came up with these ideas and distractions to keep our minds away from what was going on outside. And so every night as we lay there on the floor to protect ourselves from stray bullets, we would play games. And one of them was to see how many musical instruments we could build with things that we had around us. That is how I got to meet my creative side. Long story short, when we made it out of the war zone to a safer part of the country, I felt like a different person. I, for the first time, knew exactly what I wanted to be in life. Creative. I wanted to be creative. Now, back then, I didn't know what that meant. I just know that I went from being this kid who cared so much about school to being this other kid who just couldn't wait to go home after school and lock himself in his room to learn music or learn the piano or learn computer programming with this old book I think it was a 20-year-old book that was written in a language that I barely understood, English. Now, regardless of how they get to meet their creative sides, regardless of how they stumble upon it, you'd be surprised by the amount of creators and inventors and what I call geniuses in Africa, addressing issues like global ones like climate change or access to education or access to electricity, to basic ones like hunger or access to clean water. But as a context, most countries in Africa simply don't have the mindset, the infrastructure, or the capacity to care for the talent. So most of them just don't reach their creative potential, and some of them just end up leaving and trying somewhere else. Now, fast forward to today, it would be way too easy for me standing here on the stage with a room full of very smart people on this beautiful campus talking about this faraway land, Africa, and how it's somehow not the perfect context or environment for creativity, and for me to assume or pretend that everything is just fine everywhere else. Regardless of whether you're sitting here today watching me talk or watching somewhere online, can you say with certainty that the context or the environment in which you currently live or work or study is the absolute best when it comes to fostering or encouraging or nurturing your own creative side? I'll take a quick poll here in the audience, okay? We'll compare, on one side, productivity, all right, and getting things done, to creativity, or coming up with new ideas, okay? So considering your own context or environment, whether it's your work, the school you go to, your city, your family, let's see a show of hands for those of us in the room who think they live in a context where productivity or getting things done is the priority. All right, thank you. Now let's see a show of hands for those of us who think they live in a context or an environment where creativity or coming up with new ideas is the top priority. About 20%? And that's exactly what a recent study by Adobe found. That 75% of us feel pressured to be productive rather than creative at work. And only 25% of us think we live up to our full potential of being creative. Same study revealed that more than half of us think that the creative mind or creativity is being destroyed in school rather than nourished. Now, I'm going to be the first person to tell you that I'm not a big fan of ragging on school. That's overdone, and there's a million talks about school and the education system and what needs to be better. I'm not a big fan of ragging on families either, or the workplace, or anything for that matter. But there's a big disconnect here. And if the first step towards solving a problem is to point out the problem, and if the first step towards a solution is to admit and recognize that we have an issue or a problem, or in this case, at least a disconnect, then I'm hoping that these numbers are a step in the right direction. Now, before I leave you, and instead of giving you a lecture on life, I'd like to instead propose a toast. A toast to families where parents value and appreciate their kids' crazy ideas instead of systematically dismissing them. Because there's no better place for creativity to develop than in the family. To schools and an education system that understands the importance of fostering and nurturing individual talents instead of trying to make them fit in a one-size-fits-all box and hope they turn out okay somehow. To workplace, to careers, where creativity is not just something you practice on the weekend or after work, but where creativity is something that is the essential part of one's professional skill set because it inspires problem solving, new strategies, and new ideas. To a community, to a country, a state, a city, and a town that understands that creativity is as essential and as crucial to the survival of its people as water, food, shelter, and love. Finally, to the creative people, the young, the old, the seasoned, and the newbies, from the painter to the dancer, from the app developer to the creative writer, from the 30-year-old startup founder to the 11-year-old Congolese kid who just wants to feel safe. To the people, distractions, and circumstances that put us on the right path. And to creativity. Cheers, and thank you.